School's room 404. Detention in a room that isn't there.
After the hallways emptied of noise, they held on to shape. Empty schools are not quiet. They are overheard. The vents keep speaking. The clocks keep pretending. The lights keep agreeing to light. I should have headed to the New Wing's detention room everyone knows, and I almost did because muscle memory insists on its own rules. But the slip insisted louder. 404. The pink paper said 4th floor, north corridor, right of the labs. The north corridor is the stretch that pretends the building is older than it is. Tall windows that choose gray light even on sunny days. Cinder block painted the color of default. Handrails scuffed by generations of backpacks deciding to become battering rams. To reach it, the stairs ask you to climb a flight too tall for the number of risers. Old schools forget their geometry when budgets interrupt. At the landing, someone once etched initials into the metal strip that protects the edge of the step. The custodian's buffer has nearly erased them, but the grooves still catch a bit of dirt every winter and tell the step where grit lives. 4th floor. The air thins the way air always does near roofs. The science wing smells the way all science wings smell when teachers stay late. Bleach, vinegar. The ghost of formaldehyde that lives in cabinets, even when those cabinets swear they've been updated since the district banned anything preserved with regret. On the right, the door to 401 announces itself with a placard in brushed aluminum, institutional sans serif, corners rounded to avoid lawsuits. 403 stares across a narrow stretch of floor with a plaque that matches it. Between them, a spill of bulletin board tacked with diagrams that have bled a little in the humidity. To the right of the labs, a short dead end everyone uses as a shortcut to hide a text or cry off a quiz or practice being fine. The detour to the dead end has no sign, only the scuff trail of sneakers that have learned to lean. The corridor narrows by 2 inches there for no good reason. The floor slopes imperceptibly against the eye, but not against the calves. The only light comes from a ceiling tile replaced with a panel that tries to simulate daylight, and instead simulates the memory of daylight. Fire code demands an exit sign at the end of every corridor, even if the corridor ends in a wall. Our building compromised by installing a sign that points left at a doorway permanently propped open and painted shut. Room numbers on this stretch have always been practical. A storage closet marked S4 sits to the left, full of stacked folding chairs that will injure at least one volunteer by spring. A custodial room labeled MOP somehow still reads ironically even when you are alone. Past those, a blank section of painted cinder block holds nothing except goo spots from a bulletin board that died years ago and took its staples with it. The slip told me I would find 404 on this wall. This wall told me it had hosted glue and posters and apologies and would like to be left alone. The clock above the dead end read 3:04. The second hand juddered forward with an energy that argued with the number. A gust of conditioned air slid along the ceiling and followed the length of the corridor like a whisper choosing company. My shoes made the rubber squeak that announces a human in every high school across the country. The slip warmed under my fingers. Paper never matches its own temperature to a human hand unless the hand starts to doubt itself.
The number 404 carries baggage if you've ever waited for a web page that won't. The joke occurs to you even if you don't want it. Not found. The assistant hadn't laughed because office workers in schools don't reward sarcasm. But the building seemed happy to play along. Next to the blank stretch, a laminated evacuation map hung in a cheap black frame. The map offered a red dot that announced presence and green lines that promised exit routes. The corridor I stood in was drawn as a straight finger attached to the science hall. At its end, a hard corner to a stair, emergency use only. In the place where my eyes knew there was a wall, the cartoon suggested a door. The label under that rectangle read 404. Maps are persuasive in quiet buildings. They offer the dignity of design. I traced the green line from my red dot to the rectangle that didn't exist. My fingertip landed on paint that had layered itself 7 times over 20 years, eggshell gloss trying to be innocent. Under the paint, the cinder block waited. The block did not admit a seam. The evacuation map insisted one had been drawn. The detentions I had served before gathered in my head like stamps in a passport nobody brags about. The usual room sits above the gym, with long tables and a proctor who alphabetizes names and receives boredom like tribute. The door to that room always stays halfway open because the proctor likes to see the hallway to shame latecomers with body language. The slip had sent me away from that predictable economy to a dead-end corridor with a lying map and a number that felt like a dare. It took too long to notice that the clock stayed at 3:04. The second hand had made its arguments and lost them and returned to the original tick, stubborn or exhausted. The air that moved along the ceiling reached the dead wall and turned on itself the way water does in a glass when your finger traces the rim. Somewhere back toward the labs, a sink coughed to itself. A chair scraped across tile. Footsteps climbed the main stair, paused, and then retreated the way footsteps do when a person forgets why they climbed them. The building kept being a building, but the dead end kept misbehaving in small, legal ways. I pressed my palm flat against the wall, because talismans are allowed when nobody is watching. The paint carried the cold of the cinder block just beneath. Behind the cold, a hum announced the electrical closet that should have been 3 doors away. The hum vibrated not like a box, but like a cable held taut. The evacuation map's rectangle had claimed the position of a door between that electricity and this light. First period bled into second under fluorescent hum. A test arrived with the wrong header. The vending machine dispensed 2 warm sodas for 1 crumpled bill and then demanded a third for nothing at all. By lunch, the weather decided to imitate the gym floor after dodgeball. Sticky, echoing, unsure why it existed. Somewhere between the cafeteria line and the doorway, my name found the office intercom, and the room turned their eyes like a single organism, pretending curiosity was not a sport. Detention is rarely a story. It's a spreadsheet with chairs. It's a low-grade penance for tardy marks and undone reading logs, and the kind of attitude that shows up when sleep doesn't. The vice principal's assistant slid a pink slip across a counter that always smelled like toner and citrus wipes. Pink slips in our building list a room number like a sentence. Mine wore a number that attached a small joke to the irritation, 404. The assistant didn't laugh. Her face did the administrative neutrality that means a person has given this speech 12 times since breakfast and would like to give it 12 fewer times. She rotated the slip so the number faced me and tapped the corner once, the way a magistrate taps a gavel in a low-budget film. Room numbers in our school climb like stairs most days. Old wing, 100s. New wing, 300s. The 4th floor belongs to advanced sciences, and aspirational posters about lab safety featuring smiling teenagers wearing goggles no one would choose voluntarily. I had been to 401 for chemistry labs that taste like copper air and apologies. I had stood outside 403 to stare at a trophy case that wants to forgive a decade of losing seasons. I had cut through 405 during a fire drill because the corridor outside was a traffic jam of teenagers performing compliance. 404 did not live on any map printed for student planners. The laminated directory near the main stair leapfrogged from 403 to 405 with the cheerful confidence of people who don't believe in unlucky numbers or computer jokes. The slip didn't care. The slip has authority because paper plus signature does more harm to a teenager than metaphysics ever could. The assistant indicated the clock and the word after school and the phrase today. She pointed to the bottom line that included a note about reporting directly and not loitering and expecting supervision. The pen she used left a notch in the carbon copy like a fossil. I walked out of the office with a single instruction and a number a directory preferred to ignore. It is strange what the body remembers about a place that claims to be forgettable. The path to last bell finds itself. Lockers bang like a percussion section that lost its conductor. Posters announce Spirit Week with an enthusiasm that knows better. Somebody dribbles a basketball somewhere they shouldn't, and the ball replies with the bored thud of rubber against polished wood. When the final tone bleeds down the hallways, the building exhales the same way every day. Not relief, just routine, settling its bones. The crowd drains, the custodians swivel their carts into the wake like tugboats, teachers collect the last of their faces and herd them toward buses and carpool lines.
There are rituals for making sense of things that don't want to be sensed. Knock, count, step back and see if perspective changes truth. Breathe in to a count you can hold. The knuckles sounded their dull confession. The count arrived at 13 without having intended to. Stepping back replaced wall with wall. Breathing proved air was still part of the arrangement. The slip crumpled and uncrumpled because hands cannot leave paper alone when waiting isn't enough. The number sat there, ink thicker than sense. The building had decided to be literal about a joke made by programmers decades ago. It had drawn a room where administrative maps refused to draw one. It had given me a sentence that wanted to be a question. Detention in a room that isn't there. The bell that signals after-school activities pings in a higher register than the class change bell. It broke down the hallway like a polite suggestion rather than an order. Coaches started gathering stragglers. Theater kids turned on a string of bulbs around a mirror and tried complexion experiments. The debate team dragged a cart with cracked casters toward the media center. Detention kids drifted in two streams: the ones who accept the exchange rate of minutes for mistakes, and the ones who treat every consequence like a negotiation. My feet should have dragged me toward the predictable stream. They stayed with the blank wall because the map and the air and the clock had voted, and nobody had counted the ballots.
When the change arrived, it did not announce itself with special effects. Paint didn't peel, hinges didn't groan, ghostly hands didn't press from the other side. The darker line flexed by the width of a pencil line and relaxed. The exit sign at the corner flickered once and returned to brave steadiness. The second hand on the 3:04 clock leapt an inch and surrendered. The evacuation map fogged a little under its cheap plastic cover, as if it had breathed. Under my palm, the cold became less absolute. A heartbeat measures itself in places the conscious mind ignores until it needs proof of life. My wrist offered that proof against cinderblock that wanted to pretend otherwise. I pressed harder and felt give where there should have been none. Not softness, allowance, a panel loosening its pride, a seam deciding to be honest. School rules like to make people ask permission. Walls prefer to make people guess. I didn't knock again. Knocking is for announcements. Detention requires arrival. I pressed with the heel of my hand along the darker paint, sliding pressure toward the ghost hinge. The wall decided to be door. The give increased. The lines separated. A scent arrived from the narrow that wasn't the corridors. Chalk that hadn't been used in a building that switched to whiteboards 5 summers ago. Floor wax from a brand that district doesn't buy anymore because it makes the gym too slick. The colder air of an uncooperative thermostat. Room 404 opened by the width of a folder and stopped, like it wanted to ask if I meant it. The pink slip in my pocket answered for me with its small, reliable weight. The corridor behind held on to its light like a promise with fine print. The gap in front held on to its dark like a rule with exceptions. The clock stayed where it had decided to freeze. The evacuation map settled its breath and pretended not to have fogged. Detention is a ledger more than it is a punishment, a list of minutes traded for a chance to begin again without the math getting vindictive. Stepping into a room that isn't there felt like entering a ledger that doesn't want to balance. I moved my weight forward, past paint and into whatever the architect had erased and the building had restored. The hinge didn't creak. The seam widened to the width of a person who might have learned from the day, or might not, and needed a place to sit with that uncertainty. I drew in the cool of a room the directory refused to print, and stepped across the threshold.
The seam widened enough for a body to decide. Paint brushed the sleeve as if reluctant to admit what it had concealed. Inside, the air was older, denser, kept not by circulation fans but by disuse. A school after hours already holds its own unease. A room that the directory denies multiplies that unease until each breath feels notarized. The space resembled classrooms from another decade. Chalkboards rather than whiteboards lined the walls, their green-black faces dusted faintly as though erased with a rag that had grown tired. Chalk dust had sunk into the grooves of the wooden frame, leaving white scars against dark varnish. Long tables arranged in rows bore initials carved by generations who must have been given detentions the records forgot. Some carvings had dates that aged themselves, 79, 88, 97, yet the edges of the cuts looked fresh enough to sting fingertips. The single window on the far wall admitted no daylight, though the corridor outside had been washed in afternoon gray. This pane revealed only another wall, brick laid in a pattern not used in any wing of the school. Fluorescents buzzed overhead with a rhythm a second slower than the hallway fixtures. Their glow left corners too dark for institutional lighting, as if the bulbs knew to ration visibility. At the front stood a teacher's desk, sturdy, square,
too heavy for one custodian to move without calling another. Its surface bore a ledger, not a folder, not a detention sign-in sheet with carbon copy, a leather-bound ledger, cracked at the edges, its spine split like something that had endured decades of attendance. The first instinct is always to check for people. The corners held no shadows taller than chairs, no coats draped across chair backs, no half-open binders with homework sighing to be finished. Only the ledger waited, square in the middle, open to a page that knew it had been chosen. Lines marched across it, names written in hands that shifted from fountain pen elegance to ballpoint fatigue to gel ink curves. Each name paired with a date, each date paired with a reason. Talking back, missed assignment, fighting, cutting class, the trivial infractions that defined adolescence, stretching back long before the current principal, long before the building's last remodel. The most recent entries stopped a decade earlier. Then came blank lines. But faint imprints remained, indentations of pens pressed too hard on pages since torn away. Drag a finger across the paper, and the ghosts of words arrange themselves in grooves. They belong to years that had not been recorded officially. They belong to students who must have walked out of classrooms that still existed, carrying slips that named a room administrators swore had never been built. Chairs in detention rooms are never comfortable. These had wooden seats molded to human curves with the cruelty of ergonomics misapplied. One chair faced backward against the wall, its legs uneven by an inch. Another bore a smear of dried ink down its side, violet like school stamps. Sitting meant accepting the weight of history, and the air suggested it would be noted even if I refused.
The clock above the blackboard read 3:13. Its hands moved, unlike the dead corridor clock, but their motions seemed rehearsed rather than natural. Every tick arrived half a second late, then compensated with a double hop forward. The effect was a timepiece stuttering toward credibility. Detention rules decorate themselves across rooms. No talking, no phones, eyes forward, stay seated until dismissed. This room bore none. Instead, etched faintly into the paint above the chalkboard were numbers, almost like binary, but too irregular. 404, repeated 13 times across. Students carve initials for rebellion, not full numbers in sequence. This had been carved by something more systematic. The sound of the hallway had faded. Custodian carts squeaking, basketballs echoing, laughter from choir rehearsal, all retreated as though a door had been sealed not just in cinder block, but in atmosphere. The hum of the fluorescence became the room's heartbeat. Occasionally, a table creaked as if adjusting to the weight of someone unseen. The ledger waited. Turning a page revealed older entries, the paper yellowed, ink browned. Detentions for chewing gum when gum was still contraband, for skirt lengths, for haircuts, for records borrowed from the library and returned scratched. Punishments for fashion choices, long extinct, attitudes long pardoned. Each page drew the school further into decades that its walls had outlived. The names had no pattern, except that every fifth or sixth was crossed out by a hand sharper than the rest, a diagonal strike like a teacher's gradebook mark. On one page, a familiar surname appeared, not a classmate's, but a family one. A cousin spoken about only at reunions, a boy who had moved away 2 towns over after an incident no one described in full. His name stood with a date that didn't align with his transfer records. His reason was absence unexcused, struck through diagonally. The crossing line dug deeper into the page than ink should. The chairs seemed fuller than they had a moment ago. The uneven legs no longer wobbled. The ink smear gleamed as though fresh. The faint smell of pencil shavings carried from nowhere, partnered by the scratch of graphite on paper. But every desk surface was bare. Detention in this room didn't wait for a proctor. It waited for acknowledgement. Signing the ledger was implied. Names weren't asked. They were already written, just waiting for a hand to confess. The pink slip in my pocket vibrated with the quiet authority of paper chosen by a system older than printers. It wanted to be transferred from one ledger to another.
The wall behind the blackboard whispered faintly, like an air duct with too much echo. But it wasn't air.
It was repetition. A litany of names murmured without mouths, each fading into the next, an inventory of those who had served time in a classroom administrators deny. Some intonations held defiance, some regret, some nothing at all. When I closed the ledger, the sound hushed. The hum of the fluorescence grew louder, pressing down, a reminder that time passes differently when walls decide you've volunteered. The clock jumped 3 minutes without filling the seconds between. 3:16 stared down, a punishment disguised as proof. The seam at the door had closed behind me. What had opened willingly now resembled any other stretch of painted cinder block, a wall as plain as dozens in the building. Knocking produced nothing but dull refusal. The room had accepted me, and leaving was no longer my decision.
The eraser moved without moving. Not a slide, not a skid. One moment it lay on the tray with an unblemished felt side. The next it bore a skim of white, and the chalk grid showed a clean stripe down its face. An eraser waltzed past across the board in strokes no hand directed. It didn't clear. It refined. The 404 quilt remained, but in the center the numbers parted to leave a rectangle of slate as bare as the day it was installed. The chalk jar answered by tilting a fraction, and a stub rolled against glass with a tap quiet enough to pretend it was memory. In the rectangular clearing, measured lines drew themselves. An attendance table, the kind teachers photocopy and then annotate until the spaces look like confetti. Columns for last name, first, period, present. The present column wore its boxes like mouths waiting for a sound. Empty where they should be empty, but hungry. The room turned down the volume on the hum. A different sound took its place. A soft thrum, like the noise a library makes when two people turn a page at the same time. Names gathered in the air again, but not as whispers behind the wall. They arranged themselves without syllables, a roll call pressed into atmosphere. The instinct to answer rose like hand to forehead. No voice left my mouth. Hands in room 404 do something else when names are called. They report themselves in graphite. The chalk jar offered its stub to gravity. The stub fell, bumped the tray, and settled in the notch students use when avoiding squeaks. There is a social contract to chalk. You don't hold it too tight, you don't press too hard, you keep it away from denim you can't replace. My hand closed over it as if it belonged there, as if the classroom had approved the transfer. The board did not ask for perfection, it asked for contact. The first line under present required a mark, not a word. In ordinary rooms, a check mark competes with a circle, because teachers inherit their systems from people who trained them. Here, the mark drew itself through my fingers into a shape neither check, nor circle, nor X. It was a small diagonal paired to a smaller one, 2 slashes leaning toward each other until they almost met. The graphite equivalent of, I am here. The chalk abraded into dust across the slate. The room inhaled as though it had been waiting to breathe. Somewhere behind the board, a relay clicked. The clock reconsidered and offered 3:19 as a compromise it could live with. A chair leg bumped without anyone sitting. The ledger's page absorbed light the way a pond water takes sky and teaches it patience. Marks do not exist without patterns. After mine, the column filled. Not quickly, not one after another in any polite order, but in a rhythm that refused to be music. One mark appeared 3 lines down, as if a ghost of a girl who'd once been late for a bus had decided to serve her time again. Another climbed into a margin because the student who left it had always written to the edge of pages. A few arrived in the wrong column, reasons disguised as presents, evidence of teenagers who had learned young how to apologize by continuing.
Time in ordinary detention advances like a slow bus, visible before it arrives, predictable enough to complain about. Time in room 404 did not advance, it rearranged. The clock at 3:16 reconsidered its position and settled on 3:12 without apology. The second hand refused to illustrate how it had traveled. The hum overhead grew steadier, as if the room had decided to lower its pulse to a frequency bones could hear. The ledger waited on the desk with the patience of furniture that knows it is more than furniture. Closing it had quieted the whispers in the wall. Opening it again felt like acknowledging an adult in a hallway. The paper lifted with a weight books don't have. A blank line yawned at the bottom of the page where years had stopped keeping records. The pink slip in my pocket steered my hand before modesty could object. Paper on paper produced the friction that proves decisions. Name, date, both arrived with the neatness people adopt when they worry a teacher might grade penmanship. The line for reason blinked in its emptiness. Reasons in detention are never poetry. They are inventory. The pen moved anyway, and wrote the word that matched nothing and everything. Late. The ink sank into the page as if the sheet preferred to drink more than display. The line settled. The hum softened again. Across the room, an eraser no one had touched lay on the chalk tray with a clean edge facing outward. Chalk sticks had been reduced to a handful of stubs, each dusted the way snow dusts a shoulder when it has decided to be gentle. One stick stood upright in a jar, like a candle that had forgotten its wick. Detention in a school is a ritual with steps nobody bothers to print. Sit, be quiet, pretend to work, look guilty enough to satisfy a system that craves remorse more than reform. This room preferred different steps. The back row of chairs, empty a minute ago, now bore depressions in their seats that foam cushions make when they take attendance of the bodies that used them recently. Scratches appeared along tablet arm edges, not new, not old, just precise enough to suggest use in the last bell without witnesses. The blackboard's sheen changed. Erased math problems like ghosts at a rehearsal straightened their posture. Lines converged into grids where graphs had once lived. Then the layers peeled back the way a palimpsest reveals too much when a historian gets greedy. Under the ghosts, new chalk crawled from the right margin to the center as if tugged by an invisible hand. Not handwriting, typeset. A row of block characters insisted on their shape as if printed by a machine that had chosen chalk as its medium. 4, 0, 4. A second row beneath repeated the sequence, then a third, 13 across and 13 down, a quilt of the number that machines give when they cannot find what they were asked to find. The air shifted to carry the smell of chalk breathing. It isn't the dry sharp of dust. It's more like the smell of an old coat closet, the fabric of air brushed by tiny limestone fragments. The word that belonged under reason on the ledger felt less like an admission and more like a translation. Late was a human way to confess not found. The room wasn't punishing delay, it was storing dislocation.
The seat closest to the window made a sound students make when they drop into a chair without caring what the plastic thinks. The desk beside mine exhaled pencil shavings. Paper slid against wood in a scale that only notebook paper knows. No faces formed, no bodies appeared. The room preferred hints, the weight of attention settling, the heat of a crowd assembling without airflow changing. Detention is never about crowd control, it's about a mutual agreement to accept a box for a while. This particular box had reinvented agreement. Detention rooms usually have a proctor who reads a paperback novel and lets pages stick to themselves while pretending to monitor. Room 404 had a monitor of a different kind. In the corner by the door, a wall speaker installed at shoulder height glowed with a pinprick red the way obsolete devices still glow after nobody feeds them. The red went out, returned, out again, in a rhythm that matched neither the clock nor the hum. The pulse wasn't an announcement, it was acknowledgement. The room knew it was full now. The rules arrived at desk height. Not printed, not posted, not spoken, but present the way you feel a teacher walk into a classroom you're not supposed to be in. They sorted themselves into a series the body recognized. Do not speak because speaking confuses the catalog. Do not move seats because arrangement is attendance. Do not sleep because this is not mercy. Do not attempt to leave because leaving becomes a second offense. Work until the time becomes yours again. The last rule failed to clarify work. Homework in ordinary detention is busy work's cousin. Here, work had a different shape. The chalkboard attendance table waited. The ledger waited. The tables waited with their scars. The pencil smell waited. I took the chalk again without thinking and placed a second mark next to the first in a new column that offered no label. The board tolerated it. Lines extended from that mark to margins. They became figures at first, math done without the courage to show steps, and then turned sentence-shaped. Writing exists to put weight where otherwise you'd be lifting air. The first sentence drafted itself with the dull neatness inherited from years of avoiding scolding. A list of times I should have arrived and didn't.
The gym door I took because outside felt easier than the classroom that day. The morning the bus slid, and the 30 seconds of sliding became the excuse that wore a jacket for a month. The detour to the water fountain that ended at the counselor's office with assurances I was fine. Every late had worn reasons like costumes. They still fit. But the chalk wanted a different wardrobe. It kept dragging me back to the word that the ledger liked, not found. The room listened. It doesn't blink when students confess. It breathes. The hum dropped a little, like it does when an HVAC unit reaches load and relaxes. The seats felt less crowded for a moment, then full again, as if attendance fluctuated with comprehension. The pink slip, removed from my pocket and laid on the desk as a problem to be solved, creased itself along a fold line I hadn't made. The crease ran diagonally opposite the administrator's gouged 404, a cross-out placed on a square that never needed it. The papers we carry learn our habits.
A soft thud from the front of the room turned the eyes I could not see. The teacher's desk had a center drawer that had not been open when I signed the ledger. It now stood a finger width ajar. Inside, half glimpsed, pencils lined like soldiers, a ruler with a metal edge, a sheet of paper heavier than school stock, the kind used for certificates that administrators hand out in assemblies when they want the octaves of applause to climb. Not a certificate, a form. The top lines read themselves into my mind without permission. Date, period, student, present, reason cleared. At the bottom, a signature line lay empty outside the lines, as if drawn afterward by someone who forgot the layout should contain dignity. Forms like this are supposed to travel in manila folders, stapled with small, harmless staples that always bend wrong. This one belonged here, uncirculated. The drawer contained a pencil that carried no marks. Hexagonal cedar, eraser unworn. I picked it up. The cedar gave that smell that belongs to freshly sharpened edges and the kind of carefulness usually reserved for projects that last longer than a day. The lead met the paper the way a key meets a lock that has been used often enough to be trustworthy. The first 3 blanks filled without hesitation. The fourth, reason cleared, waited like a trick step in a staircase. Detention expects a reason to clear. Room 404 expected a reason to become true. There is a difference between writing out a sentence and putting a pencil into a word until the word yields. Not found had to become present, or the ledger would continue to drink ink forever. The only way to do that is to inventory the absences and stack them until they produce weight. Then apply that weight to a surface that knows how to hold it. The chalk complied with that logic. It kept my hand moving along the board, listing the places the day had failed to find me. The homeroom that holds banal announcements like a net. The hallway where friends gather and pretend it's a square. The corner by the library where a poster always falls half an inch every week because the tape behind it resents institutional expectation. The chalk ran shorter. The dust on my fingertips became permission instead of grime. My writing shifted from tidy to honest. The board welcomed the paragraphs without offering corrections. The tension in ordinary rooms begs for grammar to keep order. This room wanted calibration. The sentences bent toward confession without kissing it. There are ways to write the truth without letting it arrest you. The attendance table filled with marks that weren't names, and weren't points, and weren't grades. They were proofs.
The clock decided to approach 3:58 like someone tiptoeing around a sleeping dog. The second hand made cautious noises to justify its paycheck. The chairs played at being quiet bodies. The ledger didn't sulk, but it glowed as though someone had set a lamp inside its spine. The desk drawer, still ajar, had acquired another paper behind the certificate form. This one bore handwriting that recognized itself, mine, but from earlier years. Edges softened by time that doesn't measure itself well in a teenager's pockets. A pass written in freshman sycophant cursive, the kind you use when asking to leave class to find water you do not need. The pass said, "To office," and wore a brittle pencil signature that belonged to a substitute teacher who had lasted 3 days. Room 404 had been collecting people for a long time, and it had collected what they left. Not their sweaters or phones or bracelets, the things kids misplace in ordinary rooms. It had collected the paper versions of their decisions, small rectangles that carry authority the way batteries carry charge. The pass from freshman year felt silly in my palm. It also felt like a token,
and tokens behave like currency inside machines. A scratch at the back of the room drew attention without sound. On the last table, in the corner where a student usually chooses to be invisible, an object had appeared on the wood that hadn't been there when I entered. A lid from a jelly jar, flat side up, metal ridges catching institutional light. In the center, a coin lay pressed into a circle of dried glue. Heads faced the ceiling. The coin had a year I recognized as mine. Little shrines like this exist in classrooms as jokes, as decisions made by bored kids who needed to invent a god for luck. Here, the lid had weight. A small notch had been cut in the table edge under it, the width of a pencil, a trough for paying. The past knew where to go without me. Another drawer surrendered a paperclip unbent into a point. The past slid under the clip and into the notch and rested there like a receipt. The jelly lid pressed its coin down as if stamping validation. The board's chalk softened its insistence. The attendance grid acquired a new column that labeled itself without letters. Cleared. The red pinprick in the wall speaker changed to steady. The hum wrapped it the way halls wrap late fog. The presence around me shifted from crowded to companioned. Some chairs emptied. A handful stayed the weight they had been. Detention isn't always a room full of rule breakers. Sometimes it's a handful of kids who forgot to exist where someone expected them. The room knew the difference and organized itself accordingly. The window that had shown only brick found glass again. Not outside, not daylight, not anything that would allow the building to pretend this was a real view. Instead, the pane reflected the room with one error, the kind reflections choose when the story wants to move. In the reflection, the ledger's page glowed brighter than its source. The column for reasons had been filled down the last 12 names by a hand that didn't care for curves. Each line contained the same 2 words. The words were present and accounted, split by a comma, but fused by intention. The comma mattered. It implied 2 steps.
I took the pencil the Cedar had given me and wrote the same 2 words on the certificate form, because forms, even strange ones, like consistency. The lines didn't resist. The signature blank at the bottom stopped looking like an afterthought and began to resemble a threshold. The open drawer did not offer a pen. It offered an old stamp pad the color of rubber bands. School stamp pads smell like an office trying to forgive its own ink. My thumb found it, pressed, lifted, printed a smudge in the place a proctor's signature would live. Not official. Evident. The seam where door had become wall changed its mind by the width of a leaf. Air slithered around the frame and returned the scent of hallway. Lemon cleaner stretched beyond its means. A custodian's radio muttering sports in a language the room did not need. The exit sign beyond, which had flickered earlier, held steady. The clock let itself arrive at 4:04 as if amused by its own consistency for once. One thing remained unmoved. A chair near the front, second row, aisle seat. The weight in it had never lifted. The desk attached had on its surface a clean composition book, black and white marbled, corner silvered by use. No name label. No class period. A single elastic loop held a pencil with bite marks set like rail spikes. The book held shut against curiosity with the stubbornness that notebooks learn in backpacks. The board's attendance grid lacked one last mark. The ledger's bottom line under mine left one space open. The room did not compel, it indicated. Detention ends in ordinary rooms when a proctor sighs, looks at a clock, and waves boredom through a doorway. Here, ending required balance, not dismissal. Presence was accounted, but not complete. The chair waited because someone had been given a slip and never returned to sit in it. The box wanted its last piece to fit. I slid the certificate form into the ledger like you tuck a receipt into a library book you plan to return. The spine accepted it, the pages brightened along their edges, and the names stopped moving. The chalk breathed its last little scratch for the hour and rested. The red in the wall speaker changed from steady to off like a pilot light snuffed because the stove had nothing left to heat. The seam widened enough for after-school hall light to pour a stripe across the floor. Down that stripe, dust drifted like confetti that had decided to mature. The composition book stayed closed. The pencil with bites held fast in its elastic collar. The chair did not lighten. The room would keep one seat until the student who owned it came back to be found, or until a different weight admitted the truth of being missing. Rooms like this accumulate unfinished sentences. They store them so students can return and put periods where commas have gotten tired. It is not return or never. It is return when you can carry your own attendance.
The hum changed key. It did not stop. The ledger waited the way ocean waits. The door did the thing doors do when someone inside remembers there is a hallway. It cracked to corridor width, generous and indifferent. The exit sign outside behaved like an adult, pretending not to be relieved. I stood, leaving my chair's imprint among the others, a signature pressed in the kind of foam that erases itself after a minute because detention is for now, not forever. The pink slip on the desk folded into a smaller square, the way notes fold when passed without getting caught. I slid it into the ledger between the last 2 pages, because hiding laundry in plain sight is how teenagers survive institutions. One step toward the scene changed the temperature in the room by a degree the forehead knows. Another step moved me through air that had the texture of invisibly fine eraser dust. The threshold met shoes like a mat that wants to welcome without committing. The hallway received me with its floor slope, its painted cinder block pockmarks, its limp evacuation map. The clock at the dead end had decided to join the act. 4:04. Behind me the room did not slam. It recommitted to wall. Paint smoothed its conceit. The darker line returned to roller logic. The air fed itself back along the ceiling, whispering maintenance notes. The school around it continued with its own drama. Coaches corralling, theater lighting doing its small miracles, debate carts arguing with linoleum. The ledger had added a line. The attendance grid had acquired a final mark. The chair near the front still held its weight, the way buildings hold stories their directories refuse to print. One part remained for later, the part where a person returns with whatever they misplaced in themselves, brings it to a chalkboard that uses numbers like prayers, and sets it down long enough to be seen. I walked the corridor toward the stairs, the pink of the slip now gone, the hum of the room learning how to breathe behind walls it had chosen. The hallway light injured nobody. The exit sign pointed where it always points. Down one flight, the sound of the gym taking roll traveled up the stairwell like weather. At the landing, the initials carved into the metal strip looked ordinary again. Dirt teased out by buffer, letters plain and human. Schools do what they can with attendance. Rooms like 404 do what attendance cannot. The day extended 1 more inch into evening. I took it. The building allowed it. The ledger would be waiting the next time the directory decided to skirt a number and a slip insisted. Rooms fix attitude. This one fixed absence. It did not punish. It held. And holding is a harsher requirement than scolding, because it asks you to show up to your own name and stay until present changes from a mark on a grid to something heavy enough to lift. At the bottom of the stairs, the custodian's cart squeaked a rhythm I recognized from mornings. The radio muttered a score that had already been played. The front doors pushed cool spring air into fluorescent corridors like a promise. Outside, buses yawned and folded their accordion doors and prepared to leave without me. Inside, a single wall pretended it had always been a wall. The building smiled the way institutions learn to smile. I crossed the threshold and stepped into the evening with chalk still in the lines of my fingers and the shape of a seat in my legs, ready to carry both until something asked to be set down.
That night, the dream carried me back to the north corridor. The exit sign glowed steady, the clock sat stubborn at 4:04, and the wall waited, with its seam darker than the paint around it. In the dream, the wall did not ask permission. It opened before I reached it. Inside, the desks were full this time. Shadows sat with posture I couldn't decipher. Chalk marks filled the board, and the ledger snapped shut the instant I entered, as if already satisfied. The empty chair at the front was gone. In its place, the composition book glowed faintly, pages fluttering though no hand touched them. I woke before the bell rang. In the morning, the book had vanished from my backpack. Only the bitten pencil remained, resting across my notebook as if daring me to acknowledge it. I carried it back to school without telling anyone. Detention that day was scheduled for the usual upstairs room, the one with the proctor and the size. Students filed in with homework and earbuds tucked out of sight. I sat down with the pencil in my pocket and waited. The teacher called roll. My name came. I answered, but in the pause afterward, I heard it again. Not the teacher's voice, not mine. A murmur, low, directly behind my ear, the ledger's way of double-checking. Present and accounted. The teacher continued the list as if nothing had happened. My hand trembled against the desk, and the pencil rolled in my pocket, heavy as a coin stamped for payment. Some rooms fix behavior. Room 404 fixes attendance. Once it writes your name, the ledger never stops calling it.
Leaving the 4th floor should have been simple.
Down the stairwell, out through the double doors, into a late afternoon where buses still coughed and sneakers still squeaked against pavement. Yet the air clung to me the way chalk clings under fingernails. The school had resumed its usual shape. Kids straggling, coaches barking, custodians humming, but every step carried the aftertaste of a room that shouldn't exist. At home that night, the pink slip should have gone into the trash. Instead, my pocket was empty. The ledger had taken it, folded it between its pages the way a librarian tucks away a returned book. The absence of paper was heavier than the paper itself had been. My hands still bore faint lines of chalk dust. Even after washing, the smell of cedar pencil clung to skin. I opened my backpack out of habit. Folders, notes, half a sandwich that had lost ambition. But there, in the middle of the binder where no one could have placed it, rested the composition book from the front row of room 404. Black and white marbled, elastic loops still hugging its bitten pencil. It should have stayed on that desk, pinned by the weight of whoever hadn't returned to it. Now it had followed me. The book opened itself easily. Inside, page after page of neat handwriting. No name, no class header, only dates. The dates marched backward, not forward, each line reaching further into years before I was even born. Each page ended the same way. A phrase repeated in block letters, sometimes trembling, sometimes confident, present and accounted. Some entries belonged to handwriting styles I recognized from other decades. Loops too large for the lines, angled letters from the 80s, careful Gothic attempts from kids who had spent too long sketching band logos. The phrase was the same across all. Every writer had been forced to copy it, as if that was the only assignment room 404 ever gave. The last page was blank. My pencil, clean, not bitten, slid into my fingers without request. Writing the phrase felt inevitable. The lead scrawled, present and accounted, across the lines, letters neat because I couldn't bear to leave them messy. When the sentence ended, the notebook closed itself, with a clap too loud for the quiet of my bedroom.